Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the podcast. And let's just get right into it, shall we? Okay, so let's catch up and let's talk a little bit about Afghanistan. The TLDR too long didn't read on this subject is that we had to get out of there. And listen, I'm not going to pretend to have some extensive knowledge of Afghan politics, tribal relations, or any of that, or the precise timeline here, but this will pretty well sum it up. Even if we were to give the absolute best possible view towards George W. Bush and his invasion of Afghanistan, which I don't want to do, then the war itself is, at the very best, questionable as to whether it was even legal, let alone justified. The primary initial story we were told was that this war was because the 9/11 terrorists, they trained there. And so we went and we obliterated those camps. Then the war became about defeating the Taliban, which we effectively did pretty quickly, even to the point that there was evidence that the Taliban offered to surrender and even disarm as far back as December of 2001. An offer which Bush refused. Of course. Then the story became about killing Osama bin Laden because there was just no other objective that could be reasonably suggested for this war. And when bin Laden was killed in 2011, the US government just stopped pretending to even have a reason for being there. And so we remained at war in Afghanistan, and for no apparent reason, for 20 full years. And we accomplished nothing. And we never really even had any real hope of actually accomplishing anything. And the absurd thing about everything that I just said is that it is the best, the absolute best possible interpretation of the Afghanistan war. The thing we can say that is closer to the truth here is that this war never really had a real end goal, because the war wasn't really against a state or even a group. And I'm not going to argue here whether this was a good war or a bad war, but if we even assume that, a good war is possible, then this war was absolutely a bad war. And some people might hear that and think, what a bleeding heart weakling. What a disgusting woke scold with a terrible woke take. And I get it, because propaganda can be a real bastard sometimes. But those same people would probably support the troops and have flag stickers on their cars and blue line flags and worship Audie Murphy in Rambo movies. Those people would sob as they talked about how America's military lost. Oh my God, what an embarrassing loss. And whatever. If you're hung up on the win-loss record, I'm not sure what I can tell you here. Then they'll make some sort of appeal to dead American troops, which will tug the heartstrings because all of those dead men and women actually is sad. We should absolutely be upset about these deaths and the injuries. 2,448 U.S. troops have been killed. Over 20,000 American troops have been wounded, and who knows how many more have been injured in ways that we can't see and traumatized, let alone those who took their own lives due to this war already. There have also been nearly 4,000 military contractors killed in Afghanistan as well. And those who say we shouldn't have pulled out claim that to do so is an insult to these dead soldiers. And I call bullshit on that. Sending troops to die in an undefined, illegal, directionless, and pointless war, that is what's insulting to those troops. To continue sending young men and women to their deaths in some ludicrous, immoral, jingoistic, perverted view of honor and respect is, to be frank with you all, just rather disgusting. Why don't these same folks care about the 1,100 Allied soldiers killed? And why don't they seem to care about the over 66,000 Afghan fighters who have died? And why are they asking for even more of these deaths? And for some reason, these same people who claim to hold life as so dear and deaths as so costly that they want to send even more people to their deaths to honor them, they don't seem to actually give a shit about the dead Afghan civilians. That's about 50,000 lives taken from completely innocent people in pursuit of, well, nothing in particular. And why don't they care? Why don't they consider Afghans to be people worthy of consideration? I'll let you ruminate on that yourselves. We simply had to pull out of this war. And allow me to sort of live edit a thought in here because my notes didn't include anything about the suicide bombings that killed 13 U.S. soldiers, and this sort of fits in with this narrative. Firstly, why doesn't anyone mention the Afghans killed? It's because this country doesn't give a shit about dead Afghans, let's be real. But the most disturbing thing here is the call to send troops back to protect other troops. Yeah, like, where does this ever end? How does this ever stop? If these people really wanted to protect the troops, then they'd want them all home and safe, and they wouldn't want to send more troops to get wounded and die, most especially for these lies and corporate profits that we will talk about a little later. People claim to support the troops, and then they froth at the mouth to send them to die and become triple amputees in illegal mineral wars halfway around the world. I just don't get it. Another popular yarn that these pro-war goobers are using in their propaganda is some version of, what about the women in Afghanistan? The argument revolves around the idea that women are more free in Afghanistan with American forces there. And this was probably true to some extent. In Kabul. And maybe a couple of other heavily fortified and heavily defended and heavily patrolled and completely controlled green zones. But do these people think that women were just like running around in bikinis more than a mile outside of Kabul? They weren't. But here's the focal point I want people to really grok onto. And props to Area Man on Twitter for sharing this bit. Now, as I was jotting out notes for this part, I wrote the following in a legal pad. Quote, "This what about the women thing is just a talking point to activate our emotions while also making it difficult to argue against." End quote. And what I meant by that is that it's a strong bit of emotional rhetoric. After all, if you argue against it directly, you are just sounding like you hate Afghan women and don't care if they die or they are oppressed. And this is a pretty common sort of rhetorical tactic, actually, and we should watch out for it. But anyway, Area Man on Twitter there, he shared a link to a WikiLeaks page that led to a document from the CIA, which outlined ways to keep France and Germany from pulling out of Afghanistan, a war which was becoming increasingly unpopular in those countries. For Germany, the CIA was going to run basically the same playbook that they ran here in the US for years. They would use the media and the government to spread fears of drugs, terrorism, and refugees. Do these talking points sound familiar to anybody? Of course they do if you watch cable news or listen to conservative talkers in particular, but really across all media. In France, though, they had a different tactic because France didn't have the same fears as Germany. France was more sympathetic to refugees, and especially women. So what was the CIA going to do? How were they going to keep the French population supporting the war if the drugs, refugees, and terror message wasn't as effective as in, the United States or Germany? Well, they were going to use the media and the government to pass along a different message that lined up with the French sympathies. The CIA would ask, well, what about the women? Get it yet? It's a psyop. They're gaslighting and manipulating us. And I'm going to leave a link in the description to this paper so y'all can check it out yourselves. And listen, I know it sounds absolutely terrible that I'm not screaming, we should go back and save women. I get it. It's basically impossible not to sound like a bastard if we say anything other than go back and save the women. And this is why the CIA, the government, and the media are pushing this message and similar sorts of messaging so hard. The reasons that these miscreants are giving for staying in Afghanistan or even going back, ideas like that this is a betrayal of the troops, it casts the United States with a pall of shame, or what about the women? All of these reasons that we are hearing, and many of us are agreeing with just at face value, they've all been developed by professional manipulators, run through focus groups, and strategically deployed. Every single time that someone starts any sort of debate or argument or discussion with a question or assertion like, you care about children, right? Or we don't want women to die, right? They're setting you up to agree to something immoral a little bit later in the discussion. It's an old tactic that sticks around because it works. Remember this. Remember how they manipulate us with messaging. It's an incredibly important fact to always hang on to. Oh, and let me just point out here real quickly that the exact same people who are screaming that Biden should leave our soldiers there for some vacuous reason centered around misplaced pride or perhaps the very real considerations for the safety of the Afghans who helped the U.S. military, they were all cheering when Trump pulled troops from Syria, left entire bases to foreign troops, and condemned Kurds to death. Their care is not genuine. And I just want to make sure that we all understand that these people, and I'm talking about the people on TV here, they do not actually care about Afghan civilians or U.S. troops. They are worried about the profits. If they've convinced any of you otherwise, or if you've bought into their arguments, that's just the propaganda fucking with you. So, what about the women? Because Afghan women do, in fact, exist. I don't know. Seriously, I don't. But what the fuck over the past 20 years had truly changed anything over there? What would another month do? What would another decade do? What would 10 years change? Are we going to evacuate every woman from Afghanistan? Stay there forever? Stay another week? Another month? 20 more years? You know the situation is FUBAR. You're just having a hard time accepting it. The United States has never forced a regime change and successfully presented to the world a new, stable country, let alone a democratic one. Let alone actually changed the culture there. Regime change has always failed. It has always precipitated a devolution into authoritarianism and oppression. And I'll get back to the 20-year thing in a second, but the last primary argument I hear is this one. The military leaving Afghanistan was too quick and not done right. Was it done right? I don't know. I am not a general. I've never evacuated an army from a foreign country before, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm an expert. Was there a good way? A better way? Maybe? Shit, I don't know. As a matter of fact, I'll just say it definitely could have been done better. A lot better, actually. But I lack the language and the expertise to even properly critique this. I drive an 18-wheeler for a living. If you want me to help you figure out how to back a giant machine off the road into that dock that's around 3 different corners, I got you. But how to back out of Afghanistan? Nope. And my main point here, as to the pullout and how it was done, is that we should definitely talk about, or rather people who actually know how to evacuate an army should talk about it, but I can't, so I won't. And if we do have a problem with the pullout, and we all probably should, we shouldn't let that dissuade us from the fact that we absolutely had to get out. So go ahead and scream about Biden being dumb and this whole thing being a big debacle. I am not going to argue with any of that. Just don't use it as an excuse to go back or as a reason we should stay, at least in my opinion. But I do have a problem with the "it happened too quickly" crowd. How long should it have taken? Another week? A month? A year? Should we have never left? After all, the more troops who died and, would get wounded, that would be an insult, right? What about the women? Did Biden screw up the lead up, or did we leave too early? I don't know. But what could possibly have changed in that time? Whichever time frame that you picked. Listen, we were there bombing and killing and warring for 20 years. 20 full years of constant war. About 25% of the U.S. population has been born since the war started. That 25% of the population has never taken a breath when we weren't at war in Afghanistan. The oldest of those people are almost drinking age. 20 years of war, and Afghanistan fell in days. Kabul fell in hours. The Afghan army, which the U.S. spent over $88 billion to train and equip, they fired about 5 bullets before collapsing to a much smaller Taliban force. 20 years and $88 billion, and the army folded immediately. And let's be real, it was probably even more than $88 billion. The entire war is said to have cost over $2 trillion, and we didn't do shit. How the hell can anyone say that another week or month or year or 5 years or a decade would make a lick of difference? All of these fake-ass arguments were made just as Vietnam came to an ignominious end as well. And here I want to focus on a couple of things. The first is the flipping of stances of those in power. Republicans, and in particular Trump-style Republicans and libertarians, they were champing at the bit to pull out of Afghanistan for the past 4 years. The Republican Party even had a page on their website advocating for the pulling of troops. That is, until it looked bad for Biden and they removed the page and are now arguing we shouldn't have left. Because, politics. This all despite Biden simply running the game plan that Trump agreed to. Oh, and the Trump supporters thought he was a genius when he negotiated with the Taliban and was convinced to free 5,000 Taliban fighters not too long ago. And they cheered when he said the troops would be leaving. And Biden Democrats are no better. They claimed we should pull out of the war as well, and then ran away from it when the optics turned bad. The reality is, and I cannot believe I'm about to say this, Biden actually did the right thing here. But that is enough praise for that dingbat. All of these people, including Biden, are evil lackwits, in case you haven't noticed. The U.S. lost this war for sure, but there never really was a real war, was there? No, this was merely a means to an end. That end being the enrichment of the elite through Raytheon, Honeywell, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and all of the other shitbag assholes who profit off of these pointless wars. And that's just the straight up military contracts. You know what else Afghanistan is hella rich in? Natural resources and rare earth minerals. Just to kind of help point you in the correct direction for how to think about politicians in this country, this next quote here is just a couple of sentences from a Vogue article about absolute monster and former presidential candidate and current transportation secretary Peter Buttigieg. The article came out during his run for presidency. Oh, and before I read this, I want to point out that old Petey boy here, neoliberal shitstain that he is, he worked for McKinsey & Company, which is one of the most flat-out evil and despicable corporations on the entire planet. And that is no exaggeration, guys. McKinsey is the antithesis of flourishing life. Pete Buttigieg is truly a monster with no ethical or moral backbone. Anyway, here's the quote. Quote, "Showing me into a living room where books on display range from Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century to Peanuts, A Golden Celebration, he takes a seat in front of a huge resource and mineral map of Afghanistan." End quote. Yeah. This absolute dork who was running for the office of the President of the United States, was sitting in front of a natural resource map of Afghanistan. Who do you think that was for? Why do you think that this dork freaking mayor of a small town suddenly got corporate and party support to the tune of millions of dollars? You think he hung that map for the beauty of it? Do you think that he and his husband would just sit there in their living room and just admire this map of Afghanistan's mineral resources? No, of course not. This guy is just a dork, an evil, neoliberal dork. He didn't win the election, but he's now a goddamn cabinet secretary. Jesus, our country is screwed up, guys. And before I leave the topic of these lies and why we were there, the lies that we used to stay, and the lies that we tell about why we shouldn't have left, I do want to address the lies that will be used to say we should go back. Yeah, those lies have already started. We talked about the what about the women stuff and the stoking of fears about terrorism and so forth, and the reasons why these sorts of arguments work so well on us as a country. Now let's take a look at exactly who is telling us these things, okay? All of the following is from an Intercept article, and I'm going to read a big chunk of the beginning of this article and then just hammer out a list for you to save some time. Quote from the Intercept. Jack Keane has had a busy week. The retired 4-star general has been making the cable news rounds, offering scathing criticism of the White House in wake of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. On Wednesday, he appeared on Fox News where he told host Harris Faulkner that the administration made a terrible mistake in pulling our troops out and giving the Taliban the opportunity to take the country over. It's going to become a more dangerous place, threatening America, he warned, and the world is going to be a more dangerous place. On another Fox News program earlier in the week, Keane attacked President Joe Biden's withdrawal plan as embarrassing and ill-conceived, suggesting that the administration should have delayed until sometime next year. What neither Keane nor the host in either of these segments mentioned is that he has more than a merely patriotic interest in the continued occupation. Keane, a former board member at weapons maker General Dynamics, is chair of AM General, the company that makes Humvees. He also sits on the boards of Siloam Technologies, which manufactures military chemical lights and other technology deployed on the battlefield in Afghanistan, and the Institute for the Study of War, a think tank that publishes defense policy proposals with the aim of developing the next generation of national security leaders, and is backed by CACI International Inc., General Dynamics, and other defense contractors. Keane was just one of a parade of ex-military and ex-public officials who appeared on cable news this week to castigate the Biden administration for its withdrawal or for the way it was carried out. End quote. Now here are some other big names who have made the news rounds this past week and who they actually work for. One thing that the Intercept noted on every single one of these was that they were identified by their government credentials or their former military ranks, not where they actually worked, so keep that in mind as we move forward. Retired General David Petraeus, Rebecca Grant, a former staffer at the U.S. Air Force Secretary, Richard Haass, who worked as an advisor to then Secretary of State Colin Powell, and former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. Petraeus serves on the board of Optiv Security, a large cybersecurity firm that contracts with the Department of Defense, and he is a partner at KKR & Company, a global private equity firm with assets in the defense sector. In early 2020, KKR bought Novaria Group, a corporation holding a growing number of aerospace manufacturers, and he sits on the board of the Institute for the Study of War. Haass sits on the board of investment firm Lazard, which actively serves companies in the aerospace and defense sectors, and he sits on Palantir, a leading tech firm in the defense intelligence space. Leon Panetta is a senior counselor to Beacon Global Strategies, a defense consulting firm. Condoleezza Rice serves on the board of C3AI, a defense contractor. And the list could go on forever. Please, please, please always remember that if they're on TV, then they're being paid to serve you bullshit. Or their bullshit is self-serving. Here's another tidbit. Military-industrial complex stocks outperformed the rest of the stock market by almost 60% during the Afghan war. There should be no mistaking that every single one of these horrible souls was beating the drums of war on these cable outlets, and war is how they all make their money. But there is something else here as well that is starting to come out, and that's just raw jingoism and pure racism. Tucker Carlson has already begun to roll out these people are uncivilized barbarians and refugees shouldn't be allowed into this country because either they'll kill us, they're dirty and diseased, or some ridiculous great replacement / racist / electoral shit. That guy is just plain evil and serves his masters well. And I wanted to include a little bit of that rhetorical fear-mongering and othering. Othering being a concept we've talked about a lot on this podcast, just so we see that it exists and that it works. Then we have the Afghanistan Papers. We can look at those papers, which mirror the Pentagon Papers in a lot of ways, and we can see how this war was fought on very questionable reasons to be charitable. And it was declared lost and unwinnable many, many years ago. Then we look at how many U.S. soldiers, Allied soldiers, and Afghan civilians were killed in this war. And then we combine those things, the hopelessness and the death, and then we look at how long this was all known, and how all these people were killed in service of this nonsense. As military recruiters trolled poor neighborhoods and convinced young men and women to sign up and be all they can be, we can really see exactly what these people thought about our citizens and the Afghan people. Oh, and don't forget the torture chambers, because of course there were torture chambers, right? And listen, if you're currently listening to this like, what? Come on, this can't all be true. I urge and plead you to Google the Afghanistan Papers or click the link in the description to get started. Oh, yeah, there's more, actually. We can even look at people like Eric Prince of Blackwater fame, now called Academi, and of course, he runs a private equity firm. Well, this chud bastard is extorting people for $7,000 plane rides out of Afghanistan and charging even more to get them to the airport. And that last bit should highlight how quickly mercenaries are flooding Afghanistan right now. Fuck those guys too. So when we do all of that math and we do some back of the envelope figuring and we come to an answer, we see how badly we've been lied to about this war, and we see who we've been lied to by. And that list is long, and it includes every president of my lifetime. Barack Obama called Afghanistan the good war, even when he knew it was unwinnable and hopeless. Never let yourself forget that. So 20 years in a pointless, directionless war, a war that no general knew how to win because nobody even knew what winning it would look like. 20 years of sending soldiers out into the field to walk around valleys that nobody knew existed, didn't even have names, and had no strategic relevance. 20 years of many of those soldiers never returning from their pointless marches. 20 years of soldiers guarding poppy fields, turning blind eyes to crime, getting shot by Afghan soldiers they were training. 20 years of the military drone-striking weddings, murdering thousands of innocents and creating even more animosity, more enemies, more instability, more resentment, and more terrorism. 20 years of occupying a country for no better reason than stuffing the pockets of Halliburton, KBR, and DynCorp, all contractors who fed off of the military's excesses. Oh, and DynCorp employees allegedly helped smuggle children for the sex trade as well. So, yeah. Yay, military industrial child sex ring complex. Way to go. The real insult to service members is sending them to die in pointless neo-colonial wars, and the noble act is to stop these sacrifices to corporate greed before any more die. 20 years of violence, destabilization, displacement, corruption, collateral damage, aka wanton civilian murder, massacres, and death. All under a shroud of lies that this country swallowed whole cloth. Despite the current political rhetoric, the true betrayal of American troops wasn't pulling them out of Afghanistan, it was bringing them there in the first place. Do not let these ghouls convince you that going back to Afghanistan is some noble act. Do not let these ghouls convince you that leaving Afghanistan is an insult to dead service members who were killed there over nothing. Of course we should have left. We just did it 20 years too late. Oh, and just to be a little more honest here, U.S. presidents, the military, and the military-industrial complex which they serve, they've kept a state of perpetual war going in Afghanistan for much longer than 20 years. The Carter administration began funding the Mujahideen, the precursors to the Taliban, and who we will hear a little bit more about in the coming minutes, in 1979, and they called it Operation Cyclone. Of course, Reagan kept Cyclone going and celebrated the Mujahideen movement. The main early reason for this support was because Afghanistan had a leftist government in power, which could not be allowed to stand. Then that morphed into a neo-colonial and projection of military power as the U.S. supported the Mujahideen in their fight against Soviet forces. The most famous example of Reagan and the U.S. supporting the Mujahideen against the Soviets was the sale to them of Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, a weapon which, along with the AK-47, came to truly represent the war, at least in Western media. The Stinger missiles were used to shoot down the much-feared Soviet helicopter gunships, and the image of Afghan fighters firing those shoulder-launched Stinger missiles, it became iconic. Shit, even Rambo, the most American badass hero in cinematic history, went to Afghanistan to help defeat the Soviet army. Then Clinton bombs Afghanistan in an act of supposed self-defense. We all know George W. Bush launched the current ill-conceived war, and that both Obama and Trump were too cowardly to end it. The overarching point here is that this war was an imperial war, and a war meant to project power into a relatively unstable country which resides near China, Iran, and a slew of former Soviet republics. During this war, the U.S. military killed hundreds of civilians in incidents which were not reported or were actively hidden. The Guardian reported on this incident. Quote, "The Marines made a frenzied escape, opening fire with automatic weapons as they tore down a 6-mile stretch of highway, hitting almost anyone in their way. Teenage girls in the fields, motorists in their cars, old men as they walked along the road. 19 unarmed civilians were killed and 50 wounded." The military report of the incident, written by the same soldiers involved in it, later failed to make any reference to the deaths and injuries, and none of the soldiers involved were charged or disciplined. End quote. In March of 2007, CIA operatives fired on and killed a man who was moving away from them. He was deaf and couldn't hear them. And this isn't even to mention the massive loss of innocent life from drone strikes, bombings, and wanton executions. Also from The Guardian. Quote, "They range from the shootings of individual innocents to the often massive loss of life from airstrikes, which eventually led President Hamid Karzai to protest publicly that the U.S. was treating Afghan lives as, quote-unquote, cheap. The logs refer to sums paid of 100,000 Afghani per corpse, equivalent to about 1,500 pounds. End quote. Hey, President Karzai, sorry we massacred a busload of people just trying to live their lives. Here's a handful of change. We pay by the corpse. We pay by the corpse. Does this sum up America right now, or what? We pay by the fucking corpse. And as I start to wrap this up, I want to talk about something that's sort of tangential to the Afghan war and the pullout, but it also really isn't. And I'm not going to go deep here or anything, but we need to mention Julian Assange here. The reason we know about most of these bad things, the murders, the drugs, the rank profiteering, and so on, is because of WikiLeaks. And Assange right now is being held against his will, illegally, and his health is greatly suffering. The charges against him are weak and flimsy and would be thrown out by any ethical court system that might theoretically exist. He is in prison right now for revealing not just secrets of the U.S. military. After all, that could maybe have been lived with by, the military machine. But he released the deepest, darkest secrets of the military, the murders, the atrocities, and the war crimes. He showed the world exactly what the military can do to young men and women and the results of that inculcation. It's dehumanization, othering, and eventually murder. And it revealed how little the military actually cares when its soldiers go too far. So this was a war that was waged with no real military goals beyond the first weeks at best. A war which the military and government lied about for 20 years. A war which was fought primarily to privatize mineral rights in Afghanistan and to enrich the military-industrial complex and those wealthy few who sit on their boards, as well as our congresspeople who insider trade to make millions of dollars on the dead bodies of American soldiers. So yeah, of course we had to leave. And that, folks, is the end of the episode. And I appreciate you all for sticking around to the end. If you want to further support us, please feel free to, rate and review on Apple. There's a link in the description. And, I just want to thank all of you guys for being awesome listeners. I really appreciate it. I love you all. Goodbye.